September 19, 1944. The Hurtgen Forest, Germany. Captain George Wilson led his company of the 4th Infantry Division into the trees and immediately understood that everything he had learned about infantry tactics in 3 years of army training was going to be insufficient for what he was about to face. The Hurtgen Forest stretched before him in every direction, 60 square miles of ancient German forest so dense that the canopy blocked the sky completely in most places, reducing visibility to 20 or 30 feet in daylight and to nothing at all in darkness. The trees were massive, Douglas firs and pines that had been growing for decades, their trunks 4 and 5 feet in diameter, their lower branches stripped by decades of shade competition into bare with that resembled the bars of a cage. The forest floor was covered with a deep mat of pine needles that muffled sound in ways that made the location of nearby movement impossible to determine accurately. Streams and ravines cut through the terrain in patterns that no map adequately described because the maps had been made from aerial photographs that could not see through the canopy to the ground below. The Germans had been in this forest for months. They had cut fields of fire through the undergrowth, creating killing zones that covered every approach route. They had built concrete bunkers that were invisible until you were close enough to see the muzzle flash. They had laid minefields so dense in some areas that the mines touched each other, covering the forest floor with explosive traps that punished any movement off the established paths. They had registered their artillery on every clearing, every trail junction, every stream crossing, every open space in the forest where men might have to concentrate even briefly. They had done all of this because the Hurtgen Forest sat on the western approach to the Roer River dams, the massive concrete structures whose destruction or control could flood the entire Roer River Valley and either trap American forces that had crossed the river or prevent them from crossing at all. The dams were the key to the American advance into Germany, and the Hurtgen Forest was the key to the dams. American commanders had decided that the forest had to be cleared. What followed was the longest battle in American military history on foreign soil, a 3-month struggle in terrain that negated virtually every American material advantage, against defenders who had prepared the ground for exactly this battle, in conditions of cold and mud and darkness and noise that tested the limits of human endurance in ways that the men who survived never fully found words for. To understand why the Hurtgen Forest became what it became, you have to understand the strategic situation of September 1944 and the specific miscalculation that sent American infantry into 60 square miles of prepared German defensive positions when alternatives existed. The breakout from Normandy and the pursuit across France had been the most successful American military operation of the war to that point. Patton's Third Army had swept hundreds of miles in weeks. The German army in the West had appeared to be on the verge of complete collapse. American commanders, flush with the momentum of the pursuit, had allowed themselves to believe that the war in Europe might be over by Christmas. The Hurtgen Forest was one of several places where that optimism was destroyed by contact with the reality of a German army that had not in fact collapsed, and that was fighting with the determination of men defending their own soil for the first time in the war. The first American unit to enter the Hurtgen was the 9th Infantry Division, which attacked in September 1944 with objectives that its commanders believed would be achievable in days. The 9th Division fought in the Hurtgen for 3 weeks and gained approximately 3 miles. It lost 4,500 men doing it, nearly half its total strength. 3 miles and 4,500 men. The commanders who reviewed the 9th Division's experience and sent in more units were making the same decision that commanders throughout military history have made when a battle has been joined and the tactical situation has not produced the result the operational plan required. They were doubling down, committing more force to a battle that the original force had failed to win, on the theory that the problem was insufficient force rather than the fundamental unsuitability of the terrain and the approach. They were wrong about this. The Hurtgen Forest was not a problem that additional American divisions could solve by being sent into it one after another. It was a problem that required either a fundamentally different approach or the acceptance that the forest did not need to be cleared by fighting through it, that it could be bypassed, that the dams could be reached by other routes, that the cost of clearing the Hurtgen was higher than the strategic benefit justified. This recognition came eventually, but it came after 5 more American divisions had entered the forest and experienced variations of what the 9th Division had experienced. The 28th Infantry Division, which had fought from Normandy to the German border, entered the Hurtgen in November 1944 and was effectively destroyed in 2 weeks of fighting. The division that had been one of the most experienced and capable American formations in the European theater lost 6,000 men in 14 days in terrain that prevented the combined arms tactics that had made American forces effective everywhere else. The 28th Division's experience in the Hurtgen is worth examining in detail because it illustrates with terrible clarity what the forest did to American units that entered it. The division attacked with 3 regiments in parallel, pushing east toward the village of Schmidt on the eastern edge of the forest, which sat on a ridge overlooking the Roer River dams. The attack began on November 2nd, 1944, in cold rain that had been falling for days and that had turned the forest trails into channels of mud that made movement of any wheeled or tracked vehicle essentially impossible. Supplies that the attack plan assumed would be delivered by vehicle had to be carried by hand over trails that were under German observation and German fire. The 112th Infantry Regiment, attacking in the center, reached Schmidt on November 3rd, a remarkable achievement against prepared German positions in that terrain. Then the Germans counterattacked with tanks. American infantry in the Hurtgen Forest had no effective anti-tank weapons. The bazookas that American doctrine specified as the infantry's organic anti-tank capability required the operator to get within 50 yards of a tank to be effective, a requirement that in open terrain was dangerous and in the specific conditions of the Hurtgen Forest, with its limited visibility and its carefully prepared German positions, was frequently suicidal. The tank destroyers and the artillery that could have provided support were not in Schmidt because the trails that led to Schmidt were impassable for vehicles. The 112th Infantry Regiment was driven out of Schmidt on November 4th by German armor. It fell back toward the forest, pursued by German infantry and tanks, losing men and weapons and unit cohesion in a retreat that the official army history later described in terms that reflected the full scope of the disaster. By the time the regiment reached relatively secure positions, it had been reduced from approximately 3,000 men to fewer than 500 who were still effective as soldiers. The remainder were dead, wounded, captured, or so psychologically shattered by what they had experienced that they could not function. The psychological casualties of the Hurtgen Forest were a category that American medical officers had not encountered on the same scale in previous operations. The combination of the constant noise of artillery and tree bursts, the complete disorientation produced by fighting in terrain where navigation was nearly impossible, the physical suffering of cold and wet without adequate shelter, and the continuous presence of death in forms that the forest's density made impossible to avoid, produced psychiatric casualties at rates that the Army's medical system was not prepared to handle. Tree burst was its own specific horror. An artillery shell that detonates in the branches of a tree above a position creates a pattern of fragmentation that is far more lethal to men in foxholes than a shell that detonates on the ground. The foxhole that protects against ground bursts provides no protection against a burst that sends fragments downward. The German artillery in the Hurtgen was registered on the forest, not on specific positions, because the forest itself was the target, and shells that exploded in the canopy above American positions produced casualties among men who believed they were protected. American soldiers in the Hurtgen learned to cover their foxholes with logs, creating overhead protection that reduced the effectiveness of tree bursts, but the construction of log-covered positions in frozen ground under intermittent artillery fire was its own ordeal, requiring the expenditure of physical and psychological resources that were already depleted by the fighting. Private Harold Linebaugh of the 84th Infantry Division, which entered the Hurtgen in November 1944, wrote about the experience with the specific detail of a man who had never stopped trying to understand what had happened to him and his comrades in those weeks. The cold was the first thing, Linebaugh wrote. Not the sharp cold of a winter day that makes you feel alive. The deep wet cold that gets inside your clothing and your skin and your bones and stays there, that you cannot warm away because there is no warmth available, that is with you every hour of every day until you have forgotten what it felt like to be warm. The second thing was the noise. Artillery that never completely stopped. Tree bursts that came without warning. And beneath the noise, the knowledge that the forest was full of Germans who knew where you were and you did not know where they were. The Hurtgen Forest battle was simultaneously a strategic failure and a tactical demonstration of American military character at its most fundamental. The strategic failure was the decision to fight in the forest at all, to commit division after division to terrain that negated American advantages and amplified German ones, to accept losses that exceeded the strategic value of the objectives being seized. Military historians have been largely consistent in their assessment that the Hurtgen was a mistake, that the dams could have been neutralized by other means, that the forest could have been masked rather than cleared. But the tactical reality of the forest was experienced by the men in it as a series of specific problems that required specific solutions regardless of whether the strategic decision to enter the forest had been correct. The soldier in a foxhole in the Hurtgen Forest in November 1944 could not choose to be somewhere else. He could choose how to respond to the situation he was in, and the responses that American soldiers and officers made in the Hurtgen Forest reflected a quality of individual initiative and determination that the forest, by stripping away every other advantage, revealed with unusual clarity. Sergeant Jonah Kelly of the 28th Division's 110th Infantry Regiment was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on November 4th and 5th, 1944, the days when the German counterattack was destroying the regiment he was part of. Kelly organized a defensive position from the remnants of 2 rifle squads whose officers had been killed, established communication with adjacent units that had lost contact with each other, directed artillery fire that broke up a German infantry assault on his position, and held the position for 18 hours until relief arrived. He was wounded twice during those 18 hours and refused evacuation both times. Kelly's actions were representative rather than exceptional in the context of the Hurtgen. The Forest produced dozens of similar actions in every week of the campaign, men who took command when the command structure failed, who held positions that doctrine said could not be held, who found resources of endurance and courage in circumstances that should have exhausted both. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, which had fought from North Africa to Normandy and was among the most experienced divisions in the American Army, entered the Hurtgen in November 1944 and fought for a month before being relieved. The division's after-action report described the Hurtgen with a clinical precision that barely contained the emotional weight of what it was documenting. The terrain was the enemy's greatest asset, the report noted. Every feature of the ground favored the defender. Every approach to every objective was under fire. The Forest negated our air superiority, our artillery superiority, our armor, and our mobility. What remained was infantry fighting infantry at ranges measured in feet, in conditions that neither side had trained for objectives whose strategic value was less than the cost of their seizure. The Big Red One took the objectives anyway. The battle for the Hurtgen Forest finally ended in its most significant phase in December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge drew German forces away from the defensive line they had been holding, and American commanders finally recognized that the forest's strategic significance had been overestimated relative to its cost. The dams, which had been the original justification for the entire operation, were eventually seized in February 1945, and the Germans destroyed them before they could be used to support the American crossing of the Roer, flooding the river valley exactly as American planners had feared. The flooding delayed the American advance across the Roer by 2 weeks. 2 weeks of delay. For 3 months of fighting and 33,000 American casualties, the largest sustained American combat operation of the Second World War, the battle had achieved a delay of the German flooding operation of approximately 0 weeks and a delay of the American advance of 2 weeks when the dams were finally destroyed anyway. The strategic accounting of the Hurtgen Forest is brutal and unambiguous. The cost was not justified by the result. The decision to fight through the forest rather than around it or past it was one of the significant operational errors of the European campaign. None of this changes what the men who fought in the Hurtgen did or what it cost them or what it required of them. They fought in terrain that stripped away every advantage they had been trained to rely on and produced from them a quality of individual courage and determination that is not diminished by the strategic context in which it was displayed. Ernest Hemingway, who covered the Hurtgen Forest fighting as a war correspondent, wrote about what he saw with the compression that was his particular gift. The dark forest and the cold and the dead and the living and the men who were becoming neither living nor dead, Hemingway wrote. That was the Hurtgen. The men who fought there were very brave. They did not know how brave they were. They only knew they had to keep going, and they kept going. They kept going. In the cold and the mud and the tree bursts and the darkness and the mines and the concrete bunkers and the German defenders who had been preparing for them for months. They kept going because there was nothing else to do, and because the man beside them needed them to keep going, and because United States Army infantrymen in 1944 were trained to advance, and they advanced. The Hurtgen Forest cost 33,000 American casualties over 3 months. It gained approximately 10 miles of German forest and achieved a delay in the German destruction of the Roer dams of approximately 0 days. It was the most expensive and least productive battle of the American campaign in Western Europe. It was also a battle where American soldiers demonstrated, in conditions specifically designed to prevent it, that they would keep fighting when the conditions said stop, that they would hold when the conditions said retreat, and that they would advance when the conditions made advancement seem impossible. The forest is still there. The trees have grown back over the decades, covering the bunkers and the foxholes and the minefields that were cleared one by one after the war. The clearings that were killing grounds are forest floor again. The trails that channeled American infantry into prepared fire are hiking paths now, marked with signs that explain to visitors where the fighting happened. The men who fought there are gone, most of them. What remains is the record of what they did in 60 square miles of German forest from September 1944 to February 1945, the record of 33,000 casualties taken in terrain that no one should have fought through, paid for by men who did not choose the ground but chose to keep going on the ground they were given. That is the Hurtgen Forest. That is what it cost and what it proved and what the men who came out of it deserved to have known about them. They kept going. In the Hurtgen Forest, in the cold and the dark and the tree bursts, that was enough.